It started like any other night. I came home after a long day at work, hoping for a quiet evening with my wife, Miranda. But things hadn't felt right for a while, you know? That nagging feeling in the pit of your stomach that something's off. I brushed it off for months, maybe longer. Our marriage wasn't perfect, but whose is, right? She was always busy, always distant, but I chalked it up to stress or routine. We've been together long enough to go through rough patches. That's what I kept telling myself, until I caught her in the act. I had come home early, unexpectedly, and there they were, Miranda and some guy I'd never seen before. In our bed. I froze in the doorway, unable to comprehend the scene before me. It was like watching a movie unfold, only I was the lead character in a story I never signed up for. He was tall, muscular, and younger. My first thought was how typical it seemed. The cliché of the cheating wife and the younger lover. It would have almost been funny if it wasn't happening to me. Miranda didn't even flinch when she saw me. She just turned her head, her expression cool, like I'd walked in on her folding laundry instead of lying beneath another man. "Hey, babe," she said, as if we were discussing dinner plans, not the fact that she was naked with someone else. The nonchalance in her voice sent a wave of nausea through me. She didn't even try to cover up or apologize. She just lay there, like it was the most natural thing in the world. The guy, on the other hand, looked startled. He scrambled to sit up, but Miranda placed a hand on his chest, pushing him back down as if to reassure him. Like this was nothing out of the ordinary. Like this was their normal. I was the intruder in my own house. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Every part of me was screaming to do something, yell, throw something, maybe punch the guy. But I just stood there, rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the absurdity of it all. This wasn't how I'd imagined finding out about my wife's infidelity. I wasn't supposed to be here. I wasn't supposed to see this. Then she said it. "Why don't you join us?" I must have misheard. Or I was dreaming. Or maybe having some kind of mental breakdown. My wife couldn't have just said that. She couldn't have just invited me into bed with her and this guy. But her eyes, cold, calculating, told me I hadn't imagined it. Miranda had said exactly what I thought she had. And the worst part? She wasn't joking. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my head in that moment, none of them coherent. I'd caught my wife cheating, and her first instinct was to offer me a front row seat. No shame, no guilt, just an invitation. "What?" I finally managed to croak, my voice raw and hoarse. She sat up, her long hair falling around her bare shoulders, and smiled. A small, almost coy smile. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years. "It used to be just for me. I've been thinking about this for a while," she said, like we were discussing a vacation or a new couch. "You and me. Him. Together. I thought it might spice things up." Spice things up. I stared at her, trying to process what was happening, but my brain couldn't keep up. This couldn't be real. My wife, the woman I'd spent the last 10 years with, wanted me to join in on her affair. It wasn't enough that she was cheating. She wanted to make me part of it. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Couldn't make sense of it. But Miranda was watching me, waiting for an answer, and the guy, her lover, just lay there like this was something he'd done 100 times before. Maybe he had. Maybe I wasn't the first husband to walk in on them. I shook my head, more out of disbelief than in response to her proposition. "Are you serious?" I finally said, my voice louder than I intended. "You think I'm going to join you too?" She shrugged, as if my outrage was an overreaction. "Why not?" she asked, her tone casual, like she really couldn't see why I wouldn't want to. "People do it all the time. It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. That's what she called it. Not the betrayal, not the lies, not the months or years of deception. She made it sound like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a little bump in our marriage that could be smoothed over with some adventurous sex. I felt a wave of anger building inside me, threatening to explode, but I kept it in check. Barely. My fists clenched at my sides, nails digging into my palms, but I didn't move. I didn't yell. Part of me was still too stunned to do anything but stand there, frozen. She stood up, slowly, deliberately, as if to give me a better look at what I was missing. I averted my gaze, disgusted. The bed creaked as her lover shifted, clearly unsure of what his role was supposed to be in all this. Maybe he thought I'd go berserk, or maybe he thought I'd join in, like she wanted. Hell, I didn't even know what I was supposed to do. "You don't have to decide right now," she said, her voice low and seductive. She stepped toward me, reaching out, and I flinched when her fingers brushed against my arm. I felt sick, revolted by her touch. "Just think about it, okay? Think about it." I pushed her hand away, hard enough that she stumbled back a step. "You're insane," I spat, finally finding my voice. "You've lost your goddamn mind." For the first time since I walked in, I saw a flicker of emotion cross her face. Anger, maybe frustration. I didn't care. She deserved worse than anger. She deserved nothing from me. Before she could say anything else, I turned and left. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. Not with her. Not with him. Not in the home I'd thought was mine, in the marriage I'd believed was real. I needed to get out before I lost control. I drove for hours that night. No destination, no plan, just the road and the humming of my engine keeping me sane. My mind was spinning with what had just happened. My wife, the woman I'd shared a decade with, had just thrown her affair in my face and, even worse, suggested I join in. It was a mix of disbelief, anger, and humiliation. How long had this been going on? How many times had they been together in my house, in my bed? How many lies had I swallowed, oblivious to what was happening right under my nose? I pulled over at a 24-hour diner, parked in a dimly lit corner of the lot, and just sat there in the dark, trying to wrap my head around it. The image of them together kept replaying in my mind, like some grotesque loop I couldn't escape. My fingers gripped the steering wheel so tight I thought I might snap it in half. She didn't care. That was the worst part. She didn't care that I'd caught her. There was no guilt, no shame, just a casual indifference, like I was the one overreacting. I pulled out my phone, staring at the screen, half tempted to call her and demand answers. But I stopped myself. What was the point? She'd made it clear how she felt. Miranda had crossed a line there was no coming back from. I threw the phone onto the passenger seat and stared out the window. My reflection stared back at me, tired, broken, and confused. The guy in the mirror looked like a fool, a man who had been played. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, the sting in my palm barely registering. What now? I had no idea. My home didn't feel like my home anymore. My marriage was a joke. I thought about driving back there, kicking the guy out and tearing into Miranda, but what would that solve? They'd just end up together again, with or without me. My chest tightened, and I realized I was shaking. She had destroyed us, shattered everything we had built, and she didn't even flinch. All the years of trust, the years of love, none of it mattered. Was it all a lie? Was she always this person? Or had she changed somewhere along the way, and I just hadn't noticed? I rested my head against the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the anger. The diner lights flickered in the distance, and the world outside felt surreal, like it was happening to someone else. A thought crept in, dark and twisted. Maybe I should have accepted her offer. Maybe if I had just said yes, gone along with her sick fantasy, I could have gained some control over the situation. At least then I wouldn't be the outsider, the victim. I could have taken back some of the power she'd stripped from me. But that was crazy. No way was I going to play along with that. Not in a million years. Still, the thought wouldn't leave. What if? What if joining them could have given me the upper hand? Turned the tables on her and her lover. Could I have used it against her later, as leverage? The idea made me sick to my stomach, but a part of me kept entertaining it. I had to get out of my own head before I lost it completely. The diner was still open, and I needed to clear my mind. I grabbed my phone and wallet, got out of the car, and walked across the empty lot, the cool night air doing little to soothe my nerves. The place was nearly deserted. A bored-looking waitress stood behind the counter, wiping it down with a rag, and a couple of truckers sat at a booth near the back, sipping coffee and talking in low voices. I slid into a booth by the window, grateful for the quiet. The waitress came over, offering a tired smile as she handed me a menu. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yeah," I muttered, not really hungry but needing something to do with my hands. "Thanks." She disappeared behind the counter, and I stared blankly at the menu, the words blurring together. The normalcy of it all felt jarring, like the world was carrying on as usual while mine had just collapsed. A part of me wondered if this was my fault. Had I driven Miranda away somehow? Was I not enough for her? I mean, things had been distant between us for a while, but I'd chalked it up to the normal ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. It happened to everyone eventually, right? But maybe that distance wasn't normal. Maybe it was a sign that I missed. A sign that she was slipping away, finding excitement elsewhere, with someone who made her feel alive in a way I couldn't anymore. The waitress returned with my coffee, setting it down with a quiet thud. I thanked her, staring into the black liquid, my reflection rippling on its surface. It was easier to focus on the coffee than the chaos in my head. As I sat there, the sound of the door opening caught my attention. I glanced up and saw him, the guy from earlier, Miranda's lover. He walked in like he owned the place, like this was just another normal night for him. His eyes scanned the diner, and when they landed on me, he smiled. That same cocky grin I'd seen when I walked in on them. For a second, I thought I was imagining it, that maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, he was here, as real as the coffee cup in my hand, and he was walking straight toward me. I tensed, my fists balling up under the table. What the hell was he doing here? Did he follow me? Or was this some kind of coincidence? My heart pounded in my chest as he slid into the booth across from me, completely uninvited, like we were old friends. "Hey," he said, leaning back casually. "Small world, huh?" I stared at him, not trusting myself to speak. What kind of person walks into a diner and sits across from the husband of the woman he's been screwing? Did he have a death wish? He didn't seem fazed by my silence. If anything, he looked amused, like this was some kind of game to him. He picked up the menu, flipping through it casually. "I saw you leave," he said, his tone annoyingly calm. "Figured you'd want to talk." "Talk?" I finally snapped, my voice low and venomous. "About what, exactly?" He shrugged, setting the menu down and leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. "About Miranda. About us. About how this doesn't have to be as bad as you think." I blinked, too stunned to respond. This guy had the audacity to sit here, in front of me, and try to explain how screwing my wife was no big deal. Like we could just sit down and have a nice, civil conversation about it. "You're out of your mind," I hissed, barely keeping my voice in check. He smiled again, completely unfazed by my anger. "Am I? Or am I just giving you an option? You could leave right now, file for divorce, ruin your life. Or you could stay. Make it work." I was dumbfounded. He was serious. He actually thought I would consider this, that I would entertain the idea of sharing my wife with him. Like this was some kind of twisted partnership. I pushed my coffee away, my hands shaking with barely contained rage. "Get the hell away from me," I spat through clenched teeth. But he didn't move. He didn't even flinch. "You don't have to decide now," he said, his voice cool and calm. "Just think about it. I know what you saw was hard, but it doesn't have to be the end. We can all get what we want." I couldn't listen to another word. I stood up abruptly, the booth scraping against the floor, and walked out of the diner before I did something I'd regret. I stormed out of the diner, my head spinning. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it did nothing to cool the anger boiling in my chest. What the hell was that? He actually thought I'd sit there and discuss sharing my wife like it was some kind of business arrangement. I got into my car and gripped the steering wheel, breathing hard, trying to steady my racing heart. I felt like I was going insane. My wife was cheating on me, and her lover had the nerve to suggest I join them, like we could all play house together. What kind of sick world was I living in? The guy's face kept flashing in my mind, that smug, self-assured look. I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, the horn blaring briefly into the quiet night. How had my life spiraled into this? What kind of man just sits there and takes this kind of humiliation? I wanted to go back inside and confront him, maybe throw a punch, maybe something worse. But what would that solve? I'd just end up in jail, and they'd go on with their twisted little game without me. I couldn't go back home. Not yet. The thought of seeing Miranda made my stomach turn. I couldn't face her, not after what she'd done, not after what she'd become. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat, and for a second, I thought it might be her. But when I picked it up, It was an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, not in the mood for any more surprises tonight. Hello? I thought you might want to cool off before you do something stupid. His voice. The lover. I nearly crushed the phone in my hand. How the hell did you get my number? I barked. It's not that hard, he said, his tone so casual it made me want to scream. I asked Miranda for it. Thought we could talk this out. Talk this out? I was done talking. Don't call me again. Don't come near me. And stay the hell away from my wife. She's not just your wife anymore, man, he said, his voice still infuriatingly calm. That's what you need to understand. But it doesn't mean she doesn't still love you. This isn't black and white. I could barely comprehend what he was saying. Was this some kind of sick joke? You don't get to decide that, I hissed. Stay away from me. I'm just saying, it doesn't have to end ugly. She's not trying to hurt you, man. She still wants you in her life. She wants both of us. We can make this work. My hand was shaking as I ended the call and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. I couldn't listen to him anymore. I felt like I was losing my mind. How was this happening to me? How had I ended up here, sitting in my car, my marriage crumbling, while some random guy called me up and tried to sell me on the idea of sharing my wife? My phone buzzed again, but I didn't look at it. I couldn't deal with him, or her, or any of this right now. I just needed to get away, clear my head, and figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring past as I tried to outrun my own thoughts. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the images in my head. Miranda with him, her voice cool and detached, suggesting I join them like it was nothing, like it was normal. Eventually, I found myself on the outskirts of town, near the motel strip. The neon signs flickered in the distance, casting eerie glows over the empty streets. It wasn't much, but it was better than going home. I pulled into the parking lot of a cheap, run-down motel and sat there for a while, staring at the flickering vacancy sign. Maybe I should just leave for good. Pack up, walk away from it all. But where would I go? And was that really what I wanted? To give up everything I'd built with her? Let some random guy take over my life? I checked my phone. There were no more messages or calls, just that one from him. Part of me wondered if Miranda had any idea what he was doing. If she knew he was calling me, trying to pitch this insane idea of the three of us being together. Maybe she didn't care. Maybe she thought it was worth a try, in her twisted logic. I got out of the car and walked to the motel office, my legs heavy, like I was dragging the weight of everything with me. The guy at the front desk barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the key. Room 107. I made my way down the narrow, dimly lit hallway, the walls stained with years of neglect. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, the bed sagging in the middle, but it didn't matter. I wasn't here for comfort. I wasn't even sure why I was here at all. I tossed my jacket onto the chair and collapsed onto the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop racing. I grabbed my phone again, scrolling through old photos of Miranda and me. Our wedding day, vacations, smiling selfies from years ago, back when everything seemed so simple. Back when I believed we were solid. I hadn't noticed it at the time, but in the more recent photos, something was missing. Her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. How had I missed the signs? Was I really that blind? I threw the phone onto the nightstand, not wanting to see anymore. The knot in my chest was tightening, and I knew I couldn't keep ignoring it. If I didn't deal with this soon, it was going to tear me apart. But how? How do you even begin to fix something like this? I lay there for hours, listening to the faint hum of traffic outside, my thoughts spinning in endless circles. Sleep didn't come. It wouldn't, not when everything I thought I knew was crumbling around me. At some point, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of knocking. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but then it grew louder. I sat up, groggy, the room dark except for the dim light filtering in from the window. I checked the time on my phone, 2:13 a.m. Who the hell could be at my door at this hour? I got up, every muscle in my body aching, and opened the door a crack, ready to tell whoever it was to get lost. But when I saw who it was, I froze. Miranda. She stood there, arms crossed, her eyes searching mine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us knowing what to say. Then she spoke, her voice soft, almost pleading. Can we talk? I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to tell her to go back to her lover and leave me alone. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for years, wanted answers. I stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the small, dingy room, glancing around like she was out of place, like she didn't belong here. Hell, neither of us did. This wasn't supposed to be our life. But here we were. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes avoiding mine. I stayed by the door, keeping my distance, not sure I could trust myself to be near her without saying something I'd regret. I didn't know he called you, she said after a long silence. Her voice was barely a whisper. I didn't know he would do that. Is that supposed to make me feel better? I asked, my voice flat. You think that changes anything? She shook her head. No, I didn't want you to find out like this. Find out what? I snapped. That you've been screwing some guy behind my back? That you thought maybe I'd be okay with it if you just offered to let me join in? She flinched at my words, her face pale. I know how it sounds, she said quietly. But it's not what you think. I laughed bitterly. It's exactly what I think, Miranda. You cheated on me. You betrayed me. Her eyes finally met mine, and there was something in them I hadn't seen before. Fear, maybe guilt. I couldn't tell. I didn't want to hurt you, she said, her voice trembling. Then why did you? She opened her mouth, then closed it, like she didn't have an answer. Or maybe she didn't want to give me the real one. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. I walked over to the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. Why are you here, Miranda? I asked after a long pause. What do you want? I don't know, she admitted. I don't want this to be the end. I turned to face her, my hands clenched at my sides. What do you expect me to do? Forget what I saw? Pretend like none of this happened? She stood up, crossing the small space between us. No, she whispered, reaching for my hand. I don't expect that, but maybe we can figure this out. Together. I stared at her, torn between the woman I had loved and the stranger standing in front of me now. She was right about one thing. This didn't have to be the end, but maybe it should be. I stood there, Miranda's hand in mine, feeling the weight of everything crash down on me. Her touch, once familiar and comforting, now felt foreign, like it didn't belong anymore. Part of me wanted to pull away, to sever the connection completely. But another part of me couldn't let go. Not yet. Together? I echoed, my voice thick with disbelief. What do you think there is to figure out, Miranda? You're sleeping with someone else. You asked me to join you like it's some kind of twisted solution. What's left to work out? She squeezed my hand, her grip tighter than I expected. I know I hurt you, she said softly. I know you're angry, but I don't want to lose you. I yanked my hand free, anger flaring up again. You already lost me the moment you brought him into our bed. Her face crumpled, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was the first real emotion I'd seen from her since this whole thing started. But it didn't move me. It didn't change anything. I didn't mean for it to get this far, she whispered. I was just lost. I needed something different. Different? I laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and cold. So you figured screwing someone else would fix that? Her lip trembled. It wasn't about fixing anything. It was, I don't know. I can't explain it. I felt disconnected. From everything. From you. From us. I stared at her, the woman I'd shared a life with for years, and realized I didn't know her at all. Not anymore. Maybe I hadn't for a long time. The disconnect she felt wasn't just on her end. It had crept into our marriage without either of us noticing until it was too late. And what? I asked, my voice low, barely controlled. You thought if I joined in, it would somehow make things better? She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. I thought it would keep us together. That maybe it could be something we shared. The absurdity of it all hit me again, like a punch to the gut. You thought sharing you with another man would save our marriage? I don't know, she cried, her voice breaking. I don't know what I was thinking, okay? I was desperate. I didn't want to lose you." Her words cut deep, but they didn't change the reality of what she'd done. Desperation or not, she'd made a choice, and that choice had consequences. The room felt suffocating, the air heavy with everything that hadn't been said for too long. "I can't do this," I muttered, stepping away from her, needing space, needing air. "I can't pretend like this is something we can just talk through and fix." Miranda took a shaky breath, wiping at her face. "So, what do we do? Just throw it all away?" I turned to face her, the anger simmering beneath the surface, threatening to explode. "You already did that, Miranda. The second you decided to cheat, you threw it away. Not me." Her shoulders slumped, her eyes filled with regret and something else. Maybe realization. Maybe she finally understood what she'd done. Or maybe she didn't. Either way, I couldn't stand to look at her anymore. "I should go," I said, my voice flat. "I need to figure out what comes next." "Wait," she pleaded, stepping toward me. "Please, don't leave. We can work this out. We have to." I shook my head, my heart heavy with the weight of it all. "No, we don't. Not like this." She froze, her face pale, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. She knew this wasn't just some fight we could resolve with apologies and promises to do better. This was the end, or at least, it felt like it. I grabbed my jacket, my movements slow and deliberate, every step feeling like I was dragging a part of me with it. She stood there, watching me, tears still streaming down her face, but she didn't try to stop me again. She knew. As I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand on the knob. Part of me wanted to say something, anything, to make sense of the mess we were in. But what was left to say? The betrayal had already happened. The damage was done. I left the motel without looking back. I drove again, this time with more direction, though I wasn't sure where it would lead. The roads were mostly empty, the city quiet at this hour, and my thoughts were as chaotic as ever. What was I supposed to do now? Go back to our house, pretend like everything was fine? Or pack a bag and walk away from it all? I knew I needed time, space to think. But what would that accomplish? I wasn't sure. There was no blueprint for this, no clear path forward. Only confusion, pain, and the overwhelming feeling of betrayal. My phone buzzed again, and I glanced at it, half expecting it to be Miranda. But it wasn't her. It was him. Again. I clenched my teeth, my thumb hovering over the screen, tempted to answer just so I could unleash everything I was feeling on him. But I stopped myself. I couldn't give him that satisfaction. Instead, I tossed the phone into the back seat and kept driving, hoping the distance would help me figure out what the hell I was supposed to do. Eventually, I ended up in front of our house. I hadn't meant to go there, but my mind had been on autopilot, and now here I was, staring at the place that had once been my sanctuary. It looked the same as ever, calm, quiet, like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I couldn't walk through those doors without remembering what I'd seen. I couldn't look at Miranda without feeling the weight of her betrayal crushing me. And yet, I couldn't leave either. Not yet. I stepped out of the car, the cool night air brushing against my skin as I walked up to the front door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a long time before I finally turned it. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the house eerily quiet. I expected her to be there, waiting, but the living room was empty, and the house felt cold, like the life had been sucked out of it. Maybe she was upstairs, or maybe she wasn't here at all. I didn't care. Not at that moment. I walked through the familiar space, my mind racing with everything that had happened. How had we gotten here? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? Or had it been falling apart for a long time, and I just hadn't noticed? My eyes landed on the couch, and suddenly, I was exhausted. I sat down heavily, my body sinking into the cushions. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs, to face the bedroom where everything had come crashing down. Not tonight. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing in on me. There was no easy fix for this, no quick resolution. This was something that would take time, if it could be fixed at all. As I sat there, my thoughts swirling, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. I didn't look up. I didn't need to. Miranda stood in the doorway, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She didn't say anything. She just watched me, as if waiting for some sign, some indication of what came next. But I didn't have any answers. Not tonight. Miranda stood there, frozen in the doorway, her presence as heavy as the silence between us. The weight of everything that had happened hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I couldn't even look at her, not really. What was there to say? What could either of us possibly say that would make sense of this mess? I sat on the couch, feeling like a stranger in my own home. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was dark, save for the dim light filtering in through the window. I could feel her eyes on me, waiting for me to speak, to break the unbearable tension, but I wasn't ready. Not yet. Eventually, she took a few tentative steps into the room, the sound of her bare feet on the hardwood floor almost unnerving in the stillness of the house. She didn't sit down. Instead, she stood there, her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, but I knew it wasn't the temperature that was bothering her. It was the distance between us, the distance she had created. "Are you going to say anything?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a tremble in it that I hadn't heard before, like she was afraid of what I might say. I didn't answer right away. What could I say? That I was angry? Hurt? Betrayed? Those words seemed too small, too inadequate to describe the storm raging inside me. I couldn't even find the energy to be furious anymore. I just felt empty. When I didn't respond, she stepped closer, but I still didn't look at her. I couldn't. My gaze stayed fixed on some random spot on the floor, as if staring hard enough would make this whole nightmare disappear. "I didn't want this to happen," she said, her voice shaking. "I didn't mean for any of this." Those words, spoken so softly, hit me harder than I expected. She didn't mean for it to happen? How the hell does something like this just happen by accident? You don't stumble into bed with someone else. It's a choice, a decision, and she made it, over and over again. I finally looked at her, my eyes narrowing. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" I repeated, my voice low and bitter. "So what? You just tripped and fell onto him?" She flinched, the sharpness of my words hitting their mark. I didn't care. I wanted her to feel it, to feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused me. She needed to understand what she'd done, what she'd shattered. "I know it sounds like an excuse," she said, her voice barely holding together. "And I know it doesn't make sense to you. But it wasn't. It wasn't supposed to go this far." "How far was it supposed to go, Miranda?" I asked, my voice rising despite myself. "Was this just some fun little fling for you? Something to spice up your life while I sat here like an idiot?" "No," she cried, her eyes wide, pleading with me to understand something I couldn't possibly grasp. "It wasn't like that. I never wanted to hurt you." "But you did," I said coldly. "You didn't just hurt me. You broke us." Tears welled up in her eyes again, and for a moment, I felt nothing. The sight of her crying, something that would have torn me apart before, barely registered now. I was numb, hollowed out by the betrayal. She sank down onto the couch across from me, her face crumpling as the weight of everything crashed down on her. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't even know if I can." I sat back, rubbing my hands over my face, trying to ground myself in something, anything, other than this unbearable situation. "Maybe it can't be fixed," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Miranda looked at me like I'd slapped her. "Don't say that," she whispered. "Please, don't say that. We can figure this out. We just need to." "To what?" I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. "Talk it out? Go to therapy? Play happy family while you're screwing some guy behind my back?" Her face went pale, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. But again, I didn't care. I wanted her to feel what I was feeling. I wanted her to understand that this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug and forgotten. "I don't know what to do," she said, her voice small, broken. "I don't know how to make this right." "You can't," I said bluntly, the finality of the words hitting both of us at the same time. "You can't make this right." The silence that followed was suffocating. She sat there, her face in her hands, crying quietly, and I just stared at her, feeling completely disconnected. This woman sitting in front of me, the woman I'd loved, the woman I thought I knew, was a stranger now. Everything I thought we had, everything I thought we were, had been built on a lie. Or at least, that's how it felt. "I don't want to lose you," she whispered after a long pause, her voice barely audible. "I still love you." Her words hung in the air between us, but they didn't reach me. They felt hollow, meaningless. What did love even mean anymore? Was this her version of love? Lying, cheating, betraying me and expecting me to be okay with it? I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. I needed space. I needed air. "I can't do this right now," I said, my voice tight with emotion. "I need to get out of here." "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't go. Stay. Let's talk. Let's figure this out. I'll do anything." I paused at the door, my hand on the knob, my back to her. I could hear the desperation in her voice, but I couldn't bring myself to turn around. There was nothing left to say. "I don't know if there's anything left to figure out, Miranda," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this." With that, I walked out, leaving her sitting there in the dark, her sobs echoing through the empty house. I drove aimlessly again, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to forgive her, to fix things, to salvage what was left of our marriage. But another part of me, the part that had been shattered by her betrayal, knew that might never be possible. How do you come back from something like this? How do you rebuild trust when it's been so thoroughly destroyed? The thought of going back to her, of pretending like we could work through this, felt impossible. But the thought of walking away, of losing everything we had built together, was just as unbearable. I found myself back at the motel, the same rundown place I had crashed in earlier. It wasn't much, but it was better than going home. Home didn't feel like home anymore. I checked into the same room, the one with the sagging bed and the stale air. It felt like a fitting place for me to figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. I lay down on the bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, my mind racing. Could I forgive her? Could I find a way to move past this? Or was this the end? And if it was the end, what came next? As I drifted off into a restless sleep, one thing became clear. There were no easy answers. I woke up in the dingy motel room with a throbbing headache, the faint sunlight creeping through the cracks in the blinds. It was morning, but the day felt wrong, like time had slipped away from me. Everything felt heavy. My body, my thoughts, even the air. It was the kind of weight you can't shake off, no matter how hard you try. I sat up, the sagging mattress groaning under me, and ran my hands over my face. The events of the night before hit me like a punch to the gut. Miranda, the affair, her offer to share him. Every detail came flooding back with brutal clarity. There was no escaping it, no way to push it out of my mind. I hadn't heard from her since I left the house. No calls, no messages. I checked my phone, expecting, I don't know what, maybe some desperate attempt from her to explain herself. But the screen was blank, not a single missed call. The silence was deafening, and it made everything feel more real. I tossed the phone onto the bed and stared at the worn carpet beneath my feet, trying to figure out my next move. Part of me wanted to disappear, leave everything behind and start fresh somewhere else. But I knew that wasn't realistic. There were too many loose ends, too much unfinished business. Walking away wouldn't fix anything. I needed to confront her. I needed answers. I needed to know why she'd done this to us. But at the same time, I didn't think I could handle hearing her excuses. I didn't think I could stand listening to her tell me it wasn't my fault, that she still loved me, that it didn't mean anything. Those were just words. Empty words that wouldn't change what she'd done. I grabbed my jacket and left the motel, the cold morning air hitting me as soon as I stepped outside. The world was waking up around me. Cars passing by, people going about their lives like nothing had changed. For them, it hadn't. But for me, everything had. I drove without really knowing where I was going, the streets blurring past in a haze of indecision. My mind kept cycling through the same questions. Could I forgive her? Could I ever trust her again? Was it even worth trying? Eventually, I found myself parked outside the house. Our house. The place where everything had come crashing down. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the front door, wondering if I had the strength to go inside. It felt like crossing a line, like whatever happened next would define the rest of my life. The door creaked as I opened it, the sound echoing through the stillness of the house. Everything looked the same, like nothing had happened, but the air was thick with the weight of what had taken place here. The betrayal, the lies, the pain. It was all still here, lingering in every corner. Miranda was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept at all. Her eyes were red and swollen, and the moment she saw me, she straightened up, her gaze locking onto mine. We stood there for a moment, neither of us saying a word. I could feel the tension between us, the unspoken words hanging in the air, waiting to be unleashed. But I didn't know where to start. I didn't know if I even wanted to start. "Where were you?" she asked quietly, her voice hoarse from crying. I shrugged, keeping my tone flat. "Motel?" She nodded, her fingers tightening around the mug. I was worried. "Why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it. "You made your choice. I figured you'd be fine with him." Her face crumpled, and she set the mug down, her hands trembling. "It's not like that," she whispered. "You know it's not like that." I stepped further into the room, my anger simmering just below the surface. "Do I? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that." She stood up, crossing the room to stand in front of me. Her eyes were pleading, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Not anymore. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice breaking. "A terrible, horrible mistake. But it doesn't change how I feel about you. I never stopped loving you." I scoffed, stepping back from her. "You've got a funny way of showing it." "Please," she begged, reaching for my hand. "Just listen to me." I pulled my hand away, the physical distance between us mirroring the emotional chasm that had formed. "I don't know if I can, Miranda. I don't know if I want to." Her face twisted in pain, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of something. Pity, maybe, but it was gone as quickly as it came. I didn't want to feel sorry for her. I wanted to be angry. I deserved to be angry. She wiped at her eyes, trying to hold herself together. "I know I hurt you. I know I've messed everything up. But please, just give me a chance to fix this, to make it right." "How?" I asked, my voice laced with bitterness. "How do you make right sleeping with someone else? How do you fix betraying me?" She didn't have an answer. Not really. She just stood there, her silence speaking louder than any apology she could have offered. "Maybe you can't," I said, my voice softening despite myself. "Maybe this is broken beyond repair." She shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "No, no, it's not. We can fix this. We have to." I felt a lump forming in my throat, and I swallowed hard, trying to push it down. "You want me to believe that? After what you did?" "I wasn't thinking," she whispered, her voice desperate. "I was selfish. I was lost. But I don't want to lose you. I can't." Her words tugged at something deep inside me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. Part of me wanted to believe her, to believe that this was just a horrible mistake and that we could find a way through it. But another part of me, the part that had seen her with him, that had heard her offer to let me join them, knew better. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again," I admitted, my voice raw. "And without trust, what do we have?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because we both knew the truth. We didn't have anything. The days that followed were a blur of empty conversations and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. Miranda kept trying to reach me, to make me see that we could work through this, but I kept my distance. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. All I could hear were her words, her offer to include me in her twisted little affair. I slept in the guest room most nights, unable to bear the thought of being in the same bed where she had been with him. The house felt like a cage, trapping me in memories I couldn't escape. Everywhere I turned, there was a reminder of what had happened, of how everything had fallen apart. I went back to work, trying to throw myself into the daily grind, but even that felt pointless. My mind was always elsewhere, always drifting back to that moment I had walked in on them, like a broken record stuck on repeat. Then, one night, everything changed. I had just come home from work, tired and numb, when I found him standing in the driveway. The lover. He was leaning against his car, arms crossed, waiting for me. My pulse quickened, a rush of anger flooding my veins. He saw me coming and straightened up, a smug grin spreading across his face. "Hey," he said, like we were old friends. "What the hell are you doing here?" I growled, my fists clenching at my sides. "I came to talk," he said, taking a step toward me. "I figured we should clear the air. After all, we're all in this together, right?" The audacity of this guy. He actually thought he could waltz into my life, into my marriage, and act like this was some kind of open arrangement we were all going to be okay with. "You need to leave," I said through gritted teeth. "Now." He laughed, shaking his head. "You're still angry. I get it. But you don't have to be. We can make this work. We can all get what we want." I snapped. Without thinking, I lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and shoving him against his car. His eyes widened in shock, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his cocky expression. "You think this is a joke?" I hissed, my face inches from his. "You think you can just show up here and play house with my wife?" He stammered, trying to get the words out, but I wasn't listening. I was done listening, done playing nice. I released him, shoving him away with a force that sent him stumbling back. He caught his balance, rubbing at his neck where my hand had gripped him, his cocky grin replaced with something else, something more cautious. "This isn't over," he muttered, climbing into his car. "She'll come to me. You'll see." He sped off, leaving me standing there, my heart racing, my hands still shaking with adrenaline. I stood there for a long time, watching the taillights fade into the distance, wondering how the hell my life had spiraled this far out of control. Inside, Miranda was waiting, her eyes wide with worry when she saw me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who was that?" "Your lover," I spat, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "He thinks you're going to leave me for him." She looked horrified, her face pale. "That's not true," she whispered. "I swear to you that's not true." But I didn't believe her. Not anymore. I couldn't. And as I stood there, staring at the woman I had once loved, I realized something. This wasn't about forgiveness. This wasn't about fixing anything. This was about survival. And I wasn't sure if we could survive this. After that night, everything changed. Something in me snapped, broke in a way I didn't think was possible. I couldn't get the image of her lover standing in our driveway, the smugness in his voice, the way he acted like he already had won, like I was the fool in my own life. The anger I had been holding back for so long was now a constant hum beneath my skin, making it impossible to think straight. I began avoiding Miranda more than ever, coming home late, leaving early, making sure our paths barely crossed. When we did speak, the conversations were cold, distant, like we were both pretending we still lived in the same reality. But we didn't. Whatever we had before was long gone, and neither of us could admit it. A few days passed like this, days filled with nothing but strained silence and unspoken tension. And then, one night, I found myself back in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, wide awake while Miranda slept in our bedroom. It had been weeks since I'd last shared a bed with her, and the thought of even being near her felt like a betrayal of myself. I couldn't pretend anymore, but I couldn't leave either. Not yet. The next morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, when Miranda walked in. She looked fragile, like she had barely slept, her eyes red-rimmed, her face pale. She sat down across from me, her hands folded in her lap, and for the first time in days, she spoke. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I wasn't sure if I had the energy for another round of her apologies, of her desperate attempts to fix something that was beyond repair. But the look on her face told me this was different. There was something final about it, something I hadn't seen before. "About what?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral, detached. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her. "I've been thinking about everything. About what I did. About us." I stayed silent, waiting for her to continue. "I don't think we can come back from this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. I think I've ruined us. And I'm sorry, but I don't know how to fix it. There it was, the truth I had been avoiding for so long, spoken aloud for the first time. A part of me felt relief, like a weight had been lifted. But another part of me, the part that still held on to the idea of who we used to be, felt like it had been shattered all over again. I don't know if there's anything left to fix, I said, my voice steady but cold. You made your choice. She looked up at me, her eyes full of regret. I know, and I'll never forgive myself for it. But you deserve more than this. More than me. The words hung between us, heavy with the weight of everything we hadn't said. I could see it in her eyes. She was giving up. She was admitting that this was the end. I didn't want it to end like this, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. I thought we could find a way through this. But maybe that was selfish of me. I couldn't deny the pang of sadness in my chest as I watched her break down in front of me. This wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with years ago. This was someone else, someone I didn't recognize. And maybe I had been holding on to a version of her that didn't exist anymore. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice softening despite myself. I don't know if I can ever forgive you. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. I don't expect you to. I just want you to know that I never stopped loving you. Even when I messed everything up. I looked at her, the woman I had shared my life with, the woman who had once been my everything, and realized that love wasn't enough. Not anymore. Love didn't fix betrayal. Love didn't erase what she had done. And even if a part of me still loved her, that part wasn't enough to heal the wound she had left behind. I think you're right, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Maybe this is the end. She closed her eyes, her shoulders shaking as she cried quietly, her face buried in her hands. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't. I didn't have it in me. This was the reality we were living now, a reality where the damage had already been done, and no amount of love could undo it. For the first time, I felt like I could breathe. It wasn't relief, not exactly, but it was the beginning of something else, the beginning of letting go. I left the house that evening, my head clearer than it had been in weeks. The sun was setting, casting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and for the first time, I felt like I was stepping away from the wreckage of my life. Miranda and I hadn't made any concrete decisions, but the conversation had been enough. We both knew what was coming, even if we hadn't said the words aloud. As I drove, my mind wandered to the future. What came next? The idea of starting over was daunting, but it was also freeing in a way. I had spent so long wrapped up in this marriage, in the idea of who we were supposed to be, that I hadn't allowed myself to consider what life could be without her. But now I had no choice. I drove aimlessly for a while, the radio playing softly in the background, the road stretching out before me. It felt good to be moving, to feel like I was going somewhere, even if I didn't know where. Eventually, I found myself at a bar. One of those quiet places on the edge of town where people went to escape their lives for a while. I parked the car and went inside, grateful for the anonymity the dimly lit room provided. I sat at the bar, ordered a drink, and let the sounds of quiet conversation and clinking glasses wash over me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of peace. It wasn't much, but it was something. And that's when she walked in. I hadn't planned on talking to anyone that night. I just wanted to sit there with my drink and my thoughts, to have a moment of quiet away from everything that had been consuming me. But when she walked in, something shifted. She wasn't like the other people in the bar. She carried herself differently, confident but not cocky. There was a quiet strength about her, something that made me notice her right away. She took a seat a few stools down from me, ordered a drink, and glanced around the room. Our eyes met for a brief second, and she smiled, a small, knowing smile, like she could tell I was carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders. For a moment, I looked away, not wanting to engage. I wasn't ready for this. Not yet. But something about her pulled me in, and before I knew it, I was glancing back at her. She caught my eye again, and this time, she didn't look away. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice light, but with an edge of curiosity. I chuckled darkly, shaking my head. "Something like that." She raised an eyebrow. studying me for a moment before taking a sip of her drink. "You look like you've been through hell." I shrugged, not sure how to respond. "Yeah, you could say that." There was a brief silence between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like she understood without needing to ask too many questions. Maybe she had been through her own version of hell. "You don't have to tell me anything," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." It was strange, sitting there with this woman, a complete stranger, and feeling like I could open up to her. Maybe it was the drinks, or maybe it was just the exhaustion catching up to me, but I found myself talking. Not about everything, not in detail, but enough. Enough for her to understand that I was going through something that had shattered my world. She listened, quietly, nodding occasionally, but never interrupting. There was no judgment in her eyes, no pity, just understanding. When I finished, she set her drink down and looked at me with a kind of clarity I hadn't seen in anyone in a long time. "It sounds like you've been carrying this around for a while," she said softly. "Maybe it's time to let some of it go." I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. She was right, of course. I had been carrying the weight of Miranda's betrayal for so long that it had become a part of me. But now, sitting here, talking to this woman, I realized I didn't have to carry it alone. I didn't have to let it define me. "Maybe you're right," I said quietly, surprising myself with the admission. She smiled, that same knowing smile that had caught my attention when she walked in. "You've got a lot of life ahead of you," she said. "Don't let one mistake ruin it all." We talked for a while longer, about nothing in particular, just enough to fill the space between us. And as the night went on, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a full release, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new, the beginning of healing. When I left the bar that night, I didn't feel whole, but I felt lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, there was hope for the future after all. As I drove home, I thought about Miranda, about everything we had been through, and realized that while we might not survive this, I would come out the other side. And maybe, one day, I'd find someone that was real.